Emily Carter's world shattered 7 years ago on what should have been a beautiful family cruise. Instead, that journey turned into a nightmare when, without warning, her daughter and husband vanished without a trace. For years, authorities struggled to uncover what had happened that fateful day, and as time passed, hope began to fade. No new leads or suspects emerged. Then, one day, as Emily walked along an alley in a foreign city, what she saw would change everything. Even as she recalled that shocking moment, she wondered aloud before we dive into this astounding story. Please let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this video, do not forget to subscribe. The morning sun filtered through the gauzy curtains of Emily's living room, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floor. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking the inexorable passage of time. Emily sat in her living room, her eyes fixed on Detective John Matthews as he delivered the news she had dreaded for so many long, agonizing years. "Mrs. Carter," he began, his voice tinged with a mixture of sympathy and resignation. "I'm afraid we have reached a point where we need to discuss the future of your daughter and husband's case." Emily's heart clenched, but she forced herself to remain composed. At 46, she had aged beyond her years, and the weight of her family's disappearance was etched into every line on her face. Leaning forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, she asked in a whisper, "What do you mean, Detective?" Matthews sighed, running a hand through his graying hair, and explained, "It's been 7 years, Mrs. Carter. We have exhausted every lead and followed every possible trail. The case is growing cold, and we are running out of resources." Emily shook her head vehemently, her voice rising with desperation as she pleaded, "No, please, Detective. You can't give up. Lila and Marcus are out there somewhere. Lila is now 25. She might even be on one of the posters I've been putting up on the street or online. We just can't stop looking." Her eyes drifted to the family photos that adorned the walls, their smiling faces a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere that permeated the room. Matthew's eyes softened with compassion as he replied, "I understand your persistence, Mrs. Carter, but you must understand our position. Over the years, we have received countless false leads and spam calls, each one taking time and resources away from other active cases." Emily's gaze fell on a coffee table, where a thick folder lay open, filled with old evidence and reports. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the worn edges of the papers, murmuring, "We have come so far. We cannot let all this work go to waste." Matthews leaned back in his chair, his expression grave, and asked gently, "Can you walk me through what happened that day one more time? Sometimes revisiting the details can spark new insights." Emily nodded slowly, taking a deep breath as she began to recount the story, a narrative she had told countless times to police, reporters, and well-meaning friends and neighbors. Each retelling was like reliving the nightmare, yet she clung to the hope that someday, somehow, her words might lead to answers. "We were on a Caribbean cruise," she began, her voice growing distant as she recalled the events of that fateful day. "It was supposed to be a wonderful family vacation, something we had been planning for years. I remember the sound of seagulls and the smell of salt air, a ghost of that last happy day when we had docked at Curaçao, one of the stops along our route through the Dutch Caribbean. Sitting at a small cafe near the port, with tables arranged along the cobblestone street, and surrounded by vibrant, colorful buildings that looked as though they belonged on a postcard, Emily recalled how Lila had wanted to take a short walk alone. She was only 18, and we thought it would be safe. The sun was shining. There were people everywhere. How could we have known?" Detective Matthews nodded, jotting down notes as Emily spoke. His pen scratched against the paper with an unnaturally loud sound in the quiet room. By the time they finished their drinks, about 15 minutes later, they were ready to head somewhere else. "Marcus told me he was going to look for Lila while I pay the cashier," she recalled, her voice trembling as she continued, "but she still hadn't come back. I saw him walk out of the cafe, try to make a phone call. I assumed it was to Lila, but Marcus never returned either. I searched for them around the beach and market area until evening. It had been about 2 to 3 hours since I last saw them, right up until the ship was supposed to depart." I tried to reach them both, but none of them picked up my call. When I realized they were both gone, I reported it to the crew and security. Her hands trembled as she remembered the panic of that moment. They searched the ship, questioned passengers, yet there was no trace of either Lila or Marcus, as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The crew's management had instructed her to board the ship so that they could continue the discussion inside, promising to contact the local authorities on the foreign island. Yet, Emily was terrified of leaving her loved ones behind. Detective Matthews furrowed his brow as he considered the information. The jurisdictional issues, with the ship in international waters and the disappearance occurring on a foreign island, have complicated matters. The response was slower than it should have been, he explained, pulling a crisp, official-looking document from his briefcase. We have been in close contact with the Dutch authorities and Interpol over these years. Lila and Marcus's details are flagged as high priority in Interpol's database. Emily leaned forward, a flicker of hope lighting her eyes. So they're still actively searching? She asked. Matthews hesitated before choosing his words carefully. I have to be honest with you, Mrs. Carter. Amsterdam Interpol has lowered the case's priority. This is what I came here to tell you. Without new leads, resources have shifted elsewhere. Cases like this become more challenging to solve with each passing year. They will alert us if any new information comes to light. Though the hope in Emily's eyes dimmed, it did not extinguish entirely. Straightening her back, her voice took on a determined edge as she declared, I'll pay more for the investigation. Whatever it takes, just please don't let the case go cold. Matthews shook his head gently, his expression softening with sympathy. It's not about money, Mrs. Carter. We've done everything we can, but we have to prioritize our resources. Then, almost in a whisper, he added, after 7 years, how can they find my family if they don't actively search for them? Emily interrupted, her voice rising with frustration. But how can they find them if they aren't looking? She implored. The calm facade she had fought to maintain began to crack, exposing the raw pain beneath. As the detective gathered his papers, a movement that signaled the end of their meeting and the fading of another thread of hope, he promised, I promise you, Mrs. Carter, even though Interpol in Amsterdam has lowered the case's priority, my team here in Orlando will keep an eye out. If anyone comes forward with information, we'll follow up immediately. I'll give it another year of active searching, but after that, his voice trailed off, leaving the harsh reality unspoken. As Matthews prepared to leave, he turned back to Emily, his expression softening once more. Stay strong, Mrs. Carter. We're doing everything we can. Don't give up hope yet. With those final words, the detective excused himself. Emily remained seated, surrounded by the remnants of her shattered family and the fading hope of their return. The clock on the mantel continued its relentless ticking, a reminder of the time that had passed and the uncertain future ahead. Later, as the front door closed behind Matthews, Emily sat motionless on the couch, her gaze fixed on the stack of missing person posters beside her printer. The smiling faces of Lila and Marcus stared back at her, frozen in time, a painful reminder of happier days. Taking a deep breath, Emily pushed herself to her feet and moved to the printer, gathering the posters and sliding them into a large manila envelope. The routine was familiar, almost comforting in its repetition. How many times had she done this over the years? How many posters had she hung? How many strangers had she approached with her story? Grabbing her bag and phone, she paused only to check her reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back looked tired, worn by years of uncertainty and grief. Her once golden hair now streaked with gray, and deep lines creasing the corners of her eyes and mouth. Stepping out into the warm Florida morning, with humidity already beginning to build, Emily climbed into her car. The familiar leather seats offered little comfort as she settled in. Her eyes were drawn to the photograph tucked into the sun visor, a snapshot of happier times capturing Lila and Marcus on the deck of the cruise ship, their faces alight with excitement for the adventure ahead. The sight of the photo triggered a maelstrom of emotions within her. Anger, grief, and a profound sense of loss crashed over her like a tidal wave. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning white as she struggled to contain the turmoil within. Suddenly, the dam broke. A primal scream tore from her throat as she pounded her fists against the steering wheel, tears streaming down her face as years of pent-up anguish poured out in a torrent of raw emotion. "Why?" she sobbed, her voice hoarse and broken. "Why do we have to go on that damn cruise? We should have stayed home. We should have been safe, even for a few minutes." In that moment, Emily allowed herself to fall apart, letting the grief she had held at bay for so long wash over her. The cruise ship, once a symbol of adventure and family bonding, had become the focal point of her hatred and regret. If only they had chosen a different vacation. If only we had stayed home, my family would still be whole, she lamented as the storm of emotions began to subside. Gently dabbing her eyes, she took deep, shuddering breaths to regain her composure, muttering to herself, "Get it together, Emily. They need you to be strong." With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and set the GPS for a town called Tampa, about an hour's drive away, hoping that a change of scenery might do her good. It had been a while since she had renewed the poster she had put up in that area, and she knew that renewing her search could only increase the chances of someone recognizing Lila or Marcus. As Emily prepared to reverse out of her driveway, her phone suddenly came to life. The ringtone shattered the fragile calm she had managed to rebuild. The call was routed through her car's Bluetooth system, and after a brief hesitation, she answered with a raspy hello. In a distinctly European accent, a woman asked, "Is this Emily Carter?" "Yes, it is," Emily replied, curiosity piqued despite her emotional exhaustion. "Mrs. Carter, I'm calling because I believe I've seen your daughter Lila here in Amsterdam," the woman explained. Emily's heart skipped a beat as a mixture of hope and skepticism flooded her system. She had received countless calls like this over the years, each one promising a lead only to end in disappointment, or worse, an attempt to scam her out of money. "I'm sorry," Emily said in a weary, guarded tone, preparing to end the call, her finger hovering over the disconnect button. But before she could hang up, the woman's voice came through again, more insistent this time. "Please, Mrs. Carter, listen to me. I'm not after your money. Just give me a moment of your time." Something in the woman's tone made Emily pause, and despite her better judgment, she found herself wanting to hear more. "All right," she said cautiously. "I'm listening, but this had better not be a prank call." The woman on the other end took a deep breath before continuing. "My name is Sophia Green. I worked in Orlando for 6 years as an expat. I finished my project 6 months ago and returned to Amsterdam." Emily listened intently as Sophia explained how she had seen the missing person posters countless times during her stay in Orlando, ever since the case first went viral, and how the description of Lila had been seared into her memory. "When I saw her, Mrs. Carter, I was certain it was Lila," Sophia said with conviction, describing those striking blue eyes, the golden hair, and that unmistakable smile which all matched the poster she had seen so often. Emily's heart raced as she processed the information, and she asked, "Where did you see her?" In a barely hopeful tone, "At a bar here in Amsterdam." Sophia replied that she had been with a man. At that moment, Emily's mind immediately turned to Marcus. Could it be possible that they had been in Amsterdam all this time? But when she asked Sophia to describe the man, her hope faltered. "He was younger, muscular," Sophia explained. As Emily absorbed this information, a whirlwind of questions and possibilities swirled in her mind. If it really was Lila, where is Marcus? What happened to them over these past 7 years? Despite her skepticism, Emily couldn't ignore the spark of hope ignited within her, and she knew she had to pursue this lead no matter how slim the chances might be. Sophia continued, "Mrs. Carter, I need you to do something for me. If what I'm saying is true, and you're serious, please go to the Amsterdam police station and file a report. The local police here in Orlando are connected to the Amsterdam authorities through Interpol. If you make a report, it will be flagged and brought to their attention." Sophia's response was immediate and reassuring. "Of course, Mrs. Carter, I meant what I said. I'll go to the police station right away." As the call neared its end, Emily found herself asking one more question, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you certain about what you saw? Because if you are, I'll fly to Amsterdam today. Sophia paused before replying in a warm and supportive tone. Yes, I'm about 90% sure. And if you do decide to come, please reach out to me. We can meet up, and I'll be happy to help you in any way I can. With profuse thanks and a heart full of cautious hope, Emily ended the call. Sitting in her car, adrenaline coursing through her veins, she contemplated the decision before her. Part of her wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all, the idea of flying halfway across the world based solely on a phone call from a stranger. Yet another part, the part that had never given up hope of finding Lila and Marcus, was already planning the trip. As Emily put the car in reverse, her mind raced with possibilities. She chuckled softly, imagining the scenario of meeting this kind-hearted woman in Amsterdam and following her lead to a reunion with Lila. Yet doubt quickly crept in, reminding her of past disappointments. She remembered an incident 3 years ago when someone had claimed to have seen Lila in Hawaii, a wild goose chase that ended not only in heartbreak, but also with Emily becoming the victim of a robbery. Shaking her head to dispel the negative thoughts, she concentrated on the road ahead. Sophia's call had sounded sincere, far more so than the young man from Hawaii who had reached out to her years ago. If Sophia really had reported this to the Amsterdam police, there was a strong chance she wasn't lying. Despite the swirling emotions, Emily knew that if she didn't take this lead seriously, no one else would. With Interpol lowering the priority of her case and the Orlando authorities giving it just one more year, she had to give everything she had. Driving toward the police station, Emily reached for her phone once more and dialed Detective Matthews' number, her heart pounding as she waited for him to answer. Detective Matthews, this is Emily Carter. Are you at the station? I have a new lead, and we'll be there in 10 minutes. Matthews responded promptly. Yes, I'm on my way. I'll see you soon. Thanks. Emily's car pulled into the parking lot of the Orlando Police Department, the tires crunching on the sun-baked asphalt. For a moment, she sat with the engine idling, gathering her thoughts as the weight of the past 7 years pressed down on her shoulders. Yet the spark of hope ignited by Sophia's call propelled her forward. With a deep breath, Emily stepped out her car. The Florida heat hit her like a wall as the oppressive humidity clung to her skin, but the blast of air conditioning inside the station was a welcome relief. The familiar scent of coffee and paper greeted her, a reminder of the countless hours she had spent here over the years chasing leads and praying for answers. Officer Rodriguez, a fixture at the front desk, recognized her immediately. His kind, yet pained eyes met hers as he offered a sympathetic smile. Mrs. Carter, he said softly, Detective Matthews is expecting you. You can go right up. Emily nodded her thanks, her footsteps echoing in the hallway as she made her way to Matthews's office. Each step felt heavy, laden with equal measures of hope and fear. Pausing outside his door to compose herself, she knocked softly, and Matthews's gruff voice called out, "Come in." Inside, the familiar sight of his cluttered desk and the wall of case files behind him offered a strange comfort. Matthews looked up from his computer, his expression a mixture of surprise and concern. "Mrs. Carter," he said, gesturing for her to take a seat. "You said you had a new lead." Emily settled into the chair across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling as she recounted the phone call from Sophia. As she spoke, Matthews's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious interest. "A woman in Amsterdam claims to have seen Lila at a bar," Emily concluded, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. To her surprise, Matthews's lips curved into a faint smile. "We've already received a report from the Orlando Interpol Bureau," he said, leaning back in his chair as the leather creaked softly under his weight. "They explained that the Amsterdam police had notified them, and we have been made aware of the situation. The FBI has also been informed." Emily's eyes widened, her heart racing. "So, it's true. Sophia really did report seeing Lila?" Matthews nodded, turning to his computer. The soft click of his mouse filled the momentary silence as he pulled up a file. A woman named Sophia Green submitted a report to the Amsterdam police, providing a detailed description of Lila. "The description matches the woman who called you, which lends credibility to the claim. A mix of relief and anxiety washed over Emily as she leaned forward and whispered, "What happens now? How soon will we hear from them?" Matthews's expression turned serious as he replied, "As we speak, the Amsterdam police are searching the area where Sophia reported seeing Lila. However, we need to be realistic. Even if this lead is genuine, international cases are much more complex. The bureaucratic process is slower, and we're dealing with different time zones, procedures, and protocols." Emily nodded, her mind already racing ahead. "But if Lila is really there, we can't waste any time. What if I flew to Amsterdam? I could help with the search, talk to people. This woman said she could help me." Matthews's brow furrowed with concern. "Emily, remember what happened in Hawaii. I cannot, in good conscience, encourage you to rush off based on this lead alone. It's dangerous, and realistically speaking, the likelihood of this actually being Lila is low." A flicker of frustration crossed Emily's face. She understood Matthews's caution, yet her maternal instinct screamed that she must act. "Detective, my gut is telling me this is different. I can't just sit here and do nothing." Matthews sighed, running a hand through his graying hair once more. "Understand, Emily, I truly do. But please, for your own safety, don't take any drastic measures. Let the Amsterdam police do their job. We will update you as soon as we have any information." Though her decision was already made, Emily paused at the door, her hand on the handle, and said, "Thank you, Detective. I appreciate everything you've done." Matthews called after her, "Emily, please stay home, or at least put up those posters if you need to do something, but do not do anything rash. It's dangerous, even for your own safety." Emily nodded, unable to trust her voice, and left the station. The cool air inside gave way to the oppressive heat of the Florida afternoon as she climbed back in her car, her mind racing with plans. Without delay, she pulled out her phone and searched for flights to Amsterdam. A small voice in the back of her mind whispered that this was crazy, that she was potentially flying halfway across the world to meet a stranger based solely on a single phone call. But when she found a flight leaving in just 3 hours, Emily knew she had to take the chance. With a deep breath, she booked the ticket. Still sitting in the police station parking lot, she dialed Sophia's number again. The phone rang several times before Sophia's accented voice answered. "Hello? Hello, Sophia. This is Emily Carter," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I've booked a flight to Amsterdam. I'll arrive around 8 p.m. your time. Is there any chance we could meet?" After a brief pause on the other end, and with Emily holding her breath in anxious anticipation, the woman's warm voice came through, determined. "Of course, Emily. I'll meet you at the airport. Don't worry about the late hour. This is too important." Relief flooded through Emily as she replied, "Thank you, Sophia. I can't tell you how much this means to me." As the call ended, Emily took a moment to center herself. She was acutely aware of how crazy this decision might seem to an outsider. Flying across the ocean to meet a stranger who claimed to have seen her long-lost daughter at a bar sounded like the plot of a suspense novel. Yet, after losing her family on a cruise that vanished without a trace, nothing seemed more absurd than this possibility. With renewed purpose, Emily started her car and headed home. She had just a few hours to pack and get to the airport. As she drove, her mind raced with possibilities. What if this really was the lead that would bring Lila home? And if it was Lila, where was Marcus? What had happened to them over these 7 agonizing years? She pushed these questions aside, focusing solely on the task at hand. Pack, get to the airport, fly to Amsterdam, find Sophia, and hopefully finally find the answer she had been seeking for so long. Pulling into her driveway, she glanced once more at the photo of her family tucked into the sun visor and whispered with determination, "I'm coming. Just hold on a little longer. I'm coming." The flight to Amsterdam was a blur of rest and anticipation. 9 hours stretched endlessly as the plane crossed the Atlantic, each minute simultaneously dragging and rushing by. Emily dozed fitfully. Her dreams became a jumble of hopeful reunions and crushing disappointments. When the plane finally touched down at Amsterdam Schiphol Airport, her heart raced. The local time was 8 p.m., and the evening sky was already dark outside the plane's windows. After making her way through customs, amid unfamiliar Dutch announcements echoing through the terminal, Emily collected her small suitcase, hastily packed with little thought for what she might need, her mind focused solely on the meeting ahead. A quick stop at a kiosk to purchase a prepaid phone plan ensured that she could reach Sophia. The arrivals hall was bustling with activity even at this late hour. Emily scanned the crowd, searching for a face she had never seen, then pulled out her phone and dialed Sophia's number. When the call would not connect, she frowned and tried again, wondering if there was an issue with her new SIM card. As minutes ticked by without any sign of Sophia, doubt began to creep in. Had this all been a mistake, another cruel prank? Emily's mind flashed back to the incident in Hawaii, and her stomach churned with anxiety. Just as she was about to give up and head for a taxi, a voice called out behind her, "Emily! Emily Carter!" Turning around, she saw a woman approaching, around Emily's age, perhaps a few years older, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "I'm Sophia Green," the woman said as she extended her hand. A wave of relief washed over Emily as she grasped it and said, "Thank you so much for coming. I was beginning to think." Sophia squeezed her hand reassuringly and apologized. "Sorry I'm late. The traffic was a nightmare and finding parking was impossible. But I'm here now, and we'll figure this out together." They made their way to Sophia's car in the parking basement. Along the journey, Sophia filled Emily in on her background. Emily learned that Sophia was also a mother and had spent 7 years in Orlando working as an expat with a non-governmental organization focused on women's and children's resilience. After her Orlando project concluded, she returned to Amsterdam. "While I was in Orlando, I was separated from my husband and son here in Amsterdam," Sophia explained softly. "Even that was difficult enough. Twice a year, I would come back here to them and spend a weekend, really just a day because of the time difference, before heading back to Orlando." Glancing at Emily with empathy, Sophia added, "I can't imagine losing my family for 7 years. You are an incredibly strong woman, Emily." As they drove into the glittering lights of Amsterdam in the distance, Sophia asked, "Where would you like to go first? I booked a room for you at a small hotel near the bar where I think I saw Lila." Emily hesitated, torn between exhaustion and the urgent need to start searching immediately. "I know it's late," she said slowly, "but I'm not tired at all because of the time difference. Is there any chance we could go to the bar now?" Nodding in understanding, Sophia replied, "Of course, don't worry about me. I want to help you in any way I can." They drove through the lively city streets, and as they neared the area where Sophia had seen Lila, Emily's anticipation grew. The car pulled up outside a modest apartment building, just a short walk from the bar in question. "This is where I've booked your room," Sophia explained. "It's not fancy, but it's clean and close to where we need to be." After leaving Emily's luggage in the car, they made their way to the bar. The streets were alive with pedestrians and the vibrant nightlife of Amsterdam in full swing. And as they neared the establishment, Emily's heart pounded with anticipation. Inside the dimly lit bar, filled with a low hum of conversation, Emily's eyes darted from face to face, desperately searching for any sign of Lila. Sophia led her to a spot where Emily pulled out a photograph of Lila from her bag, the same photograph she had always kept in her car. "Excuse me," Emily said to the bartender, her voice trembling as she showed him the picture. "Have you seen this woman recently?" The bartender studied the photo and then shook his head, replying, "I'm sorry, but the police have been asking about this girl all day. We told them we haven't seen her." Though disappointment washed over Emily, she refused to give up hope. Exiting the bar, she noticed they were near the edge of the red light district, the infamous neon glow visible in the distance. Noticing Emily's gaze, Sophia gently touched her arm and said, "If we're going to search that area, we should first go to the police station. I can help identify you as Lila's mother, which might aid the search. The red light district can be dangerous, and people there won't take kindly to us asking too many questions on our own." Emily nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in Sophia's words. They returned to the apartment to drop off Emily's luggage and complete the check-in process. Emily insisted on paying for her own room, thanking Sophia for handling the arrangements. Once done, they set out for the police station. Although the evening air was cool, the walk, only supposed to take 10 minutes, became longer as Sophia suggested they take a shortcut through the red light district to cut the time in half. It was a route Emily had not intended to take, but with the urgency of their mission, she agreed. As they navigated the narrow streets, alive with neon lights, the pulsating beat of electronic music from nearby clubs, and a mixture of languages creating an entirely different world, Emily's footsteps quickened. Though the district was busy, the alleyways they cut through were quiet and isolated. Lost in her thoughts and trying to ignore the discomfort rising in the pit of her stomach, Emily was distracted and gradually fell behind. The city's energy pulsed around her, but her mind was elsewhere, spinning with questions. Is Lila really here? Is she safe? What kind of life has she been living? Could they possibly be close? Suddenly, Sophia froze in place, and although Emily did not notice at first, she soon heard Sophia call out, "Hey, Emily, come back." Her voice was thick with urgency, and when Emily turned quickly, her heart sinking with a twinge of guilt for not staying closer, she noticed that Sophia's eyes were locked onto one of the windows down an alley. "What's going on?" Emily asked, confused. "The police station is that way, right?" she added, but Sophia's gaze remained fixed on the window. Emily followed it, her curiosity growing, and saw a woman sitting on a bed wearing minimalist clothing, a simple, almost plain crop tank top and ripped short jeans. Emily blinked, her heart skipping a beat. The woman looked so familiar that her breath caught as she looked closer. Sophia's voice broke through her thoughts, shaky but firm. "I'm sure it's her. I saw her earlier. This is the same woman." Emily's chest tightened as she moved closer to the window, her pulse quickening as she took in every detail. The blonde hair, the delicate features, and the quiet resignation in the way she sat her day. "It has to be Lila. It must be her," Emily whispered, her voice unsteady. "This is Lila, my daughter." Without thinking, she began to knock frantically on the glass, her hands trembling, her heart pounding as she tried to make the woman see her, to make her understand. Yet the woman did not seem to recognize her. She simply stared back with confusion in her eyes. Sophia looked at Emily, her face etched with concern, but Emily did not stop. Her hand struck the glass again and again, each knock louder than the last, as she cried, "Please," Emily shouted. "It's Lila. It's my daughter, Lila. Can you hear me, darling?" Inside the window, the woman grew increasingly uncomfortable, shifting in her bed and glancing around nervously. When Emily knocked once more, the woman stood up, looking flustered, and without a word quickly turned and disappeared from view. Moments later, a large, muscular security guard emerged from the door of the establishment, a brothel with a hard, impassive face. He was imposing, nearly a foot taller than Emily, his broad shoulders blocking the light behind him. "You need to leave," the security guard said in a low, firm voice. "This is not a place for public disturbances." Emily's heart dropped into her stomach as she pleaded, "This is my daughter." Her voice trembled with emotion as she cried, "Lila, she's been missing for so long. She's here. I know it. Please, you have to help me." The security guard remained unmoved, his eyes cold as he took a step closer, his hand already reaching for his radio. "I'm calling the police if you don't leave," he warned, his tone growing more serious. Yet Emily refused to back down, her hands clenched into fists as she stood her ground, unwilling to let go of the only lead they had. Before the situation could escalate further, Sophia stepped forward, pulling out her phone and quickly dialing the Amsterdam police. She explained the situation in rapid Dutch, and although Emily could catch only bits and pieces of the conversation, she understood that Sophia was informing them about Lila and their location. Sophia then looked up at the neon sign reading "The Velvet Room" and said to the police, "This is where she was seen." Emily's heart raced, her breath shallow, barely containing the surge of anxiety. Just as she was about to speak, a man emerged from the brothel. His eyes scanned the scene, and he noticed the commotion immediately. Striding over with an air of authority and a hardening expression, he addressed them. "You're scaring my customer and my staff. You need to leave." Emily's heart pounded as she added, "We're looking for that woman. Her name is Lila. She's my daughter, and we need to speak to her." The man's lips twisted into a sneer as he scoffed. "Her name's not Lila," he chuckled, shaking his head. "She's not who you think she is." Sophia did not flinch at his words. She continued to stare at him, her gaze unyielding. But Emily's legs felt as if they might give out beneath her, and a desperate thought crossed her mind. Must she be wrong? This had to be clear. Just as they were about to argue further, the distant sound of sirens reached their ears, growing louder with each passing second. The man's demeanor shifted in an instant. His face paled as he shot a quick glance over his shoulder toward the brothel, his eyes flickering back to Emily and Sophia with a look of panic creeping into his expression. Without another word, he dashed toward the entrance, slipping back inside, but not before grabbing the woman, whose name he claimed was Tracy, by the arm and pulling her toward the back door as if he intended to flee with her. "No, stop," Emily cried, but the man did not hear her, his grip tightening around her arm as he pushed toward the exit. Before they could react, the sound of heavy boots pounding against the ground echoed in the street. The police had arrived. Officers stormed into the brothel with a commanding presence. "Stop! Put your hands in the air!" one officer shouted as they advanced toward the man and the struggling woman. The man froze, his back to the officers, his hands raised slowly as he turned to face them with a cocky smirk, attempting to dismiss the situation. "These women are crazy," he said with mockery in his voice. "Her name is not Lila. It's Tracy. They got it all wrong. She isn't missing." The officers remained impassive, their eyes narrowing as they assessed the situation. "We need to see some identification," one of them said calmly, "and we'll need to speak to her as well." In that split second, the man's smirk faltered. Emily saw a flicker of fear in his eyes before anyone could react. He turned on his heel and attempted to run for the back door, but the police were quicker. One officer lunged toward him, grabbing him by the arm before he could get more than a few feet away. With a swift motion, they wrestled him to the ground, the sound of cuffs clicking shut echoing through the alley. The man was arrested in seconds, his attempt to flee thwarted. Meanwhile, Emily's eyes remained fixed on the woman she believed to be Lila, the woman, known on the streets as Tracy, who still stood there with a face masked by confusion and fear. The officers moved in quickly, speaking to her, but Emily could barely make out their words. All she could focus on was the woman's face, desperately searching for any sign that would confirm or deny what her heart was hoping for. Sophia stepped closer to Emily, her hand gently resting on her shoulder. "It's going to be okay," she murmured, but Emily barely heard her. Her mind was consumed by a single, repeated thought. Is this really Lila? Outside the brothel, the atmosphere was charged with tension. An officer led the young woman and the man out of the building as Emily and Sophia watched the police gather the belongings of the man, his phone, wallet, and what appeared to be a taser. As they searched through his wallet, the police uncovered his ID and confirmed his identity as Victor Shaw. They then pushed him into a police car while speaking to him in Dutch. Sophia helped translate for Emily in English, and one of the officers explained, "He is not on the wanted list yet, but with his last name it seems he is connected to a group we have been tracking for trafficking. They want to know how much he knows about them." Victor spat on the ground, his face twisted in anger. "I won't say anything," he muttered in thick, defiant Russian-accented English. The officer gave a sharp nod and said, "Let's see about that," in accented Dutch as he slammed the door of the police car shut. Victor was left to simmer in silence while the officers turned their attention back to Emily and Sophia. One of them gently guided the woman, whom Emily still believed might be Lila, or at least whose identity was in question, toward them. The woman's movements were slow and sluggish, as if she were struggling to make sense of everything around her. Her speech was slurred, words blending together, and her eyes glazed over in confusion. Emily's heart twisted as she asked in a cracking voice, "Lila, is that you?" Her eyes searched the woman's face with practiced intensity, noting that her eyes were not fully focusing. instead staring blankly out at the street. Sophia moved even closer, placing a reassuring hand on Emily's arm. Suddenly, Emily's heart nearly stopped when she noticed that the woman's pupils were wide and her eyes shone in an almost unnatural way, as though she were only half aware of what was happening. She's on something," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. Sophia gave a grim nod in agreement, and an officer stepped forward with a grave expression. "You're right, ma'am. We need to get her medical attention first. We can't do anything until she is sober. Otherwise, we won't be able to question her properly. It's too dangerous." Emily nodded in understanding, her hands squeezing Sophia's as the officer continued. "We'll get her to a clinic near the police station. It's not a full hospital, but it's equipped to handle detox and get her cleaned up." Emily and Sophia were then escorted to one police vehicle, while the young woman, still identified as Tracy, was taken in a separate car. The three vehicles pulled away. The one carrying Victor veered off in a different direction toward the station. The drive to the clinic was quick, the sirens cutting through the still night air as the officers kept a close eye on the young woman, ensuring she did not slip further into unconsciousness. When they arrived, the medical team was already waiting, taking the young woman inside with swift efficiency. Emily and Sophia were led into a waiting area as the door closed behind them, cutting off their view of the clinic. Emily's hands shook, but she tried to steady her breathing. "Is it really her?" she whispered to herself, desperate to believe it was Lila. Sophia's gaze softened as she placed a comforting hand on Emily's back. "We don't know yet, but we're getting closer," she said quietly. A few minutes later, an officer entered the waiting room from the clinic. His expression was grave as he announced, "We have secured her ID." He held up a small card with a photograph and stated, "Her name is Ariana Johnson, but her street name is Tessa." Pausing to glance at the door where the medical team worked, he added, "We've radioed the station to run her name through the system. We're still waiting for an update." At that moment, a wave of nausea twisted in Emily's stomach as she wondered, what if the woman wasn't Lila? I've come so far, and the thought of it all being a mistake is almost unbearable. She did not know how she would handle it if this wasn't her daughter. Perhaps what Detective Matthews had said was right, a very low chance that this woman could actually be Lila. Time seemed to drag on in agonizing slowness as they waited for updates from the medical team. Every crackle of the police intercom sent a jolt of adrenaline through Emily's veins, her heart racing with hope and fear. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet as the dispatcher greeted the officer again. Sophia's eyes widened as she understood what was being said in Dutch. "What did they say?" Emily asked in a trembling voice. "The police said that before she became Ariana Johnson, she was known as Lila Carter. Tessa is her street name. They've confirmed it through her ID and documentation of a birth name change request from past." The realization hit Emily like a freight train. Her daughter, her missing daughter, was in that room. She could feel the weight of the moment crushing down on her chest, her breath quickening, her heart racing as tears welled up in her eyes. "That's her. That is Lila," she managed to say in a broken sob before wiping her eyes and asking, "Can I speak to her now, please?" An officer exchanged a glance with Sophia before turning back to Emily and saying, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we have to follow procedures. We need to make sure she's stable first and get all the information we can. Once we reach the station, we'll allow you to speak with her." Emily wanted to argue, to break through the bureaucratic wall that kept her from her daughter, but she could only nod, her heart heavy with both grief and relief at finally knowing her daughter was alive and just behind that door. After a long moment of waiting in silence, the door to the clinic finally opened, and a member of the medical staff emerged with a relieved expression. "She's regained consciousness," the nurse said in a calm, reassuring tone in a foreign language. The police officers exchanged glances before turning back to Emily and Sophia. Emily rose from her seat as one officer instructed, "Please wait here. We'll take it from here." As she paced around the waiting area, nervously picking at her nails, the tension was almost tangible. Muffled voices could be heard from inside the clinic, but the words were indistinct, and time seemed to stretch endlessly as they waited. Eventually, the door opened again, and the officer who had been inside stepped out with a grim face, announcing, "She's ready," as he gestured for the young woman to be escorted out. The young woman, Tessa, appeared confused, her eyes darting around as if trying to make sense of her surroundings. Hesitantly, she spoke in a soft, fearful voice. "Am I in trouble? Where am I? Am I in trouble for the drugs? Where's Victor?" Emily's heart clenched at the mention of Victor. The officer responded firmly, but factually, Victor Shaw has been arrested on suspicion of human trafficking and exploitation. He's connected to a larger group whose leader is Iter SOV. He won't be troubling you anymore. At the mention of his name, Tessa's eyes widened, and she stood frozen. Then, as her gaze shifted, she locked eyes with Emily and whispered, "Mom, is that you?" Emily's breath hitched, tears welling in her eyes as she could hardly believe it. After all these years, after all the heartache, her daughter was standing before her and recognized her. A tremble ran through Emily as she nodded and managed to say, "Yes, Lila, it's me. I missed you." Without another word, Lila rushed into Emily's arms, pulling her into a tight embrace. Emily held her daughter with all the love and relief she had stored up for so long, whispering, "I'm so glad to see you." Though officers intervened gently to separate the two, speaking in soft but firm tones, Emily's voice broke as she apologized for the disruption. "I'm sorry. I hate to disrupt your reunion, but we need to get moving. We'll continue at the station," one of them said. Emily nodded, holding her daughter's hand tightly and never letting go as they were guided outside. Eventually, they were separated into different police vehicles, Emily and Sophia in one, and Lila, once known as Tessa, in another. At the station, they were led into an interview room where Emily could barely contain her emotions as she looked at her dazed daughter, who had finally become more alert. "I thought I'd never see you again," Lila, her daughter said, her voice cracking, adding, "I thought I'd given up on you, Mom, that I would never escape this nightmare." Emily's heart shattered at her daughter's words, but she gently touched Lila's face and whispered, "I search for you every day, through posters, the internet. I never stopped looking." Lila nodded slowly, her eyes filling with sorrow as she began piecing together her story. It all happened so fast. Although her voice grew more stable, it was still tinged with fear as she recounted, "I was taken on Curacao when we were on that cruise. Dad saw me. He chased after the car, caught up just as it stopped in some alley. He tried to fight them off, but they overpowered him. There were 6 of them. They made him get in the car, too. They took us to a warehouse, and he fought so hard to protect me. But they beat him, tortured him, and they killed him." Emily's breath caught in her throat, her face paling with guilt and heartbreak. She had once even doubted whether her husband might have been involved, but hearing Lila recount the events in such painful detail shattered every lingering hope. Lila continued, her voice empty and distant. "They drugged me. When I woke up, I had no idea where I was. I was surrounded by men in black clothes. And there were other women too, all scared and crying. There were like 10 or 11 of us, maybe more. I can't even remember how many. It's all just a blur now." The pain in Emily's chest intensified as Lila spoke, her voice faltering with every passing word. "The first 5 years were the hardest," Lila said softly. "They broke me. I was a model at first, then a dancer in nightclubs. They sold me to many men like Victor Shaw. I can't remember much of those years. I was always drugged, always under their control." The officers listened attentively as Lila recounted her horrors, typing her words into the system. Though Emily fought back tears, they eventually flowed freely. Her daughter had endured so much, and the guilt and sadness threatened to overwhelm her. The police, solemnly absorbing the weight of Lila's words, informed them, "We will need to conduct a DNA test. We'll also reach out to authorities in Orlando, and immigration matters will be addressed tomorrow. Further questioning will be necessary, as Lila may be able to provide valuable information about the other women or the men involved in these trafficking activities. We hope you will cooperate with us." Emily and Lila both nodded, the gravity of the moment sinking in. Throughout the exchange, Sophia had been silently supportive, and as she turned to Lila with a warm smile, she said, "I'm just glad you two found each other again." Emily glanced at Sophia, her gratitude impossible to express. "You saved her, Sophia. You found her and brought her back to me. I can never repay you for that." "I owe you a lifetime," Sophia replied softly. "You don't owe me anything. You're a mother who never gave up, and that's what matters. You kept fighting." As the DNA samples were carefully collected, the officers discussed their next steps. How Lila's information would be processed, how they would begin the work of dismantling the trafficking ring that had held her captive for so long, and they assured them that every effort would be made to expedite the process. In that quiet moment, Emily's mind wandered to all the years stolen from her family, the grief she had carried, the emptiness she had felt. But now, for the first time in a long while, she could see a future with Lila by her side. With a grateful squeeze of Sophia's hand, Emily realized that although the scars, the trauma, and the lingering addiction might never fully disappear, together they could begin to heal. They had endured the worst, and they would face whatever came next as one united family. And so, as Emily, Lila, and Sophia stepped out of the police room to face the next part of their journey, Emily's heart felt lighter than it had in years. Through the legal proceedings that followed, Emily came to understand that the road to recovery would be long and fraught with obstacles, but it would be worth every step. Together, they would confront the scars, the trauma, and the betrayal of the past, and with Lila finally reunited with her mother, a spark of hope began to kindle, a hope that, despite everything she had endured, Lila would eventually find her way to healing. Emily knew that whatever the future held, they had already endured the worst, and they would never stop fighting for each other. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more great stories like this one. Share this video with your friends and family, and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Stay tuned for our next video, and check out others you might have missed. See you next time.